Joan Kuhn, and I'm the program coordinator at the library. I'd like to welcome you and tell you a little bit about today's author. William Maz is the author of two novels, The Bucharest Dossier, which was published in 2022, and the sequel, The Bucharest Legacy, The Rise of the Oligarchs, which just came out in June of this year. Both novels are international spy thrillers, just so you know, my personal favorite book, that take place during the waning years of the Cold War. They have both received multiple awards and have been optioned for movie deals. William was born in Bucharest, Romania, of Greek parents, and came to the U.S. as a child. His passion for writing began as an undergraduate at Harvard, then continued through his years at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, Yale residency, and his medical career. He studied writing at Harvard, the New School, the Writers' Studio in New York, and with Gordon Lish. He is presently writing full-time. His website is www.williammez.com. Please welcome William. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here on a rainy afternoon. It's a good crowd. I'm here to talk about two books that are listed as spy thrillers, although I have to admit I'm using the genre in order to talk about other things at the same time. I want to talk about the communist system versus the capitalist system, what it's like to be an immigrant from one of these communist countries and live in a free world where you don't have to stand in line for food. About a love lost and regained that I talk about in the first book, and other issues that come up even though this is the spy genre that I'm dealing with. The first book, The Bucharest Dossier, I have to tell you a little bit about in order to talk about the sequel, The Bucharest Legacy. The Dossier is a book structured like a Russian doll. It is a love story inside of a spy thriller, inside of a historical novel. The events in it of the revolution of 1989 are true to the best of history's ability to find out what the truth is. Excuse me. So the first book, The Bucharest Dossier's hero is a Romanian expat who came here as a young person, like I did, who became a CIA analyst, was recruited during his years in college, and is now a unique analyst because he is handling an asset, a mole inside the KGB, codenamed Boris. The strange thing about it is that nobody knows who Boris is, including Bill Heflin, my hero, himself. One of the mysteries in the first book is how Boris got in touch with Bill Heflin and started giving him intel from the KGB, eventually becoming the best asset they have. So in December of 1989, when the book starts, we have to remember what happened in history during that time. The Berlin Wall has already fallen. All the other former communist countries have changed from communism to some form of democracy, and they've done so peacefully, all except one, Romania. In December of '89, Romania is the only country left that is still communist. And so everybody's expecting something to happen. At that time, it was being led by Nicolae Ceausescu, who had been in power since 1965, and he was a hardline Stalinist. His main strength came through his secret service, the Securitate, which spied on practically every citizen and put over 100,000 people in psychiatric wards if they spoke up against the government. Bill Heflin, in December of '89, gets a message from Boris to come to Bucharest to create history. And that intrigues the CIA and intrigues Bill Heflin, and they send him to Bucharest. But Bill Heflin is an analyst. He doesn't know how to conduct himself in the field, which, by the way, is a great trick that authors use, because if you're not a former CIA analyst or former CIA agent, you don't know as much as the next writer who was. So you create a character who is also ignorant of field operations. And so you don't look stupid doing that. But I learned a great deal doing the research in about the CIA and about everything that went on during the revolution. Now, let me tell you a little bit about my life. I was born in Bucharest, like the author, like the character, of Greek parents. I was able to leave with my family when I was 6, and we stayed in Athens in a refugee camp for 2.5 years. It was a former military camp made up of wooden barracks and outdoor toilet and so forth. I went to school there for 2.5 years. And then we came to America. My father was a doctor who had studied medicine in Romania, using French textbooks, by the way, which was interesting. So you had to learn French in order to learn medicine. So for me, English is my third language. I learned it when I came when I was 8. I didn't know a word. So excuse me if I have an accent. Bill Heflin is sent to Bucharest. Now, he has another reason for going, because when he was 6, he left his childhood sweetheart behind, a girl named Pusha, which comes from the Romanian word Păpușa, which means little doll. And there was a real Pusha in my life, although everything else is fiction. We can go into later how a writer uses parts of his life to create a novel. You don't use everything, and even if you use a name, you don't use the real events that happen. You blend them into the book that you're writing. So Heflin is sent to Bucharest for 3 reasons. One is to find out what Boris wants with this, come to Bucharest to create history. What does he mean? Secondly, he wants to find out who Boris is. Nobody knows, including Heflin himself. And thirdly, they want to shape, the CIA wants to shape how Romania exits the communist world. Romania during that time, and the several years afterward, was the Wild West of espionage. Every country had spies, because this whole transition process could go either way. Russia wanted those countries, even if they left communism, to still remain as part of their sphere of influence. Gorbachev was in charge of Russia at the time, and Gorbachev's idea was to have a kinder, gentler socialism, but still not let go and make it into a full-fledged democracy. Ceausescu hated him because Ceausescu wanted to remain hardline Stalinist, as did Honecker in East Germany. And so they hated each other, Ceausescu and Gorbachev. And in fact, Ceausescu was always afraid he was going to be toppled, not by the United States or Western Europe, but by the Russians. In fact, at some point, he created a special unit called Unit U-0920, whose main task was to spy on his own underlings to make sure they were not meeting with KGB operatives and planning to topple him. So he was very paranoid. So Heflin goes to Bucharest, where he meets up with Boris. And Boris is a very unique character because he seems to know everything about Heflin and about his life and about his family. And he becomes the puppeteer in the first novel. So that is the introduction to that, and you will know that during this novel, those three parts, those three plots, the love story of finding Pusha, the mystery with Boris and what he wants and who he is, and the revolution itself, all blend in. Every good book which has more than one plot, and this one has three, has to blend them in. They can't all go live parallel without them being connected. What happens, just to tell you historically, the revolution starts in Timișoara, which is this city in the Hungarian section of Romania, because of a priest named Laszlo Tokes, who is anti-communist. The secret police, the Securitate, want to take him away and put him in some village so he will be quieted. They're afraid to arrest him or kill him because of the population. But anyway, the population doesn't even let them take him away. From a few thousand people, the crowd grows to over 100,000 in Timișoara. And at some point, there are gunshots. Now, at first, nobody knows where the gunshots start from because the military is standing to one side, the police is standing to another, and the secret police, the Securitate, is mingled among the population, but the shots are not coming from them. They're coming from snipers on the rooftops. And the odd thing about it is that these snipers are shooting at everybody, not just the people, but the military and the police, and probably even the Securitate. So the military panics, and they start shooting into the crowd, and that's where the slaughter starts. This thing goes on for several days. The tanks eventually come in. There are first-hand reports of tanks plowing into the crowds, going after men, women, and children. In the middle of the night, trucks come and pick up the bodies and incinerate them, so nobody knows exactly how many people died. The estimate for the revolution is about 1,500 to 2,000, but again, there are a lot of people missing which are not listed as dead, and these people were probably incinerated. So as the revolution spreads to Bucharest, the capital, Ceausescu tries to give a speech. He is booed. Eventually, the people enter the building. He escapes with his wife, and this is funny because this actually is in the book, but it actually happened. He goes in the elevator with a few of his men to the rooftop where a helicopter is waiting. And the elevator, a bronchitic little thing, stops between the top floor and the next to the top floor. It stops between floors at the perfect time. The doors don't open. The Securitate people pry them open. Eventually, they lift the Ceausescu's to the floor above. Eventually, they get to the helicopter, and the people are right behind them. They get into the helicopter. Helicopter takes off. But the pilot is against them, as is everybody else in the city. So he fakes an alarm. He presses a button in the middle of his flight into the countryside. He presses a button, an alarm goes off, and he tells Ceausescu that they have been spotted by radar and that they need to immediately land. Ceausescu goes crazy, starts yelling, land, land, everywhere, anywhere. So they do. They eventually get to a highway. They stop a car. It was the doctor driving. The doctor after a little while, fakes that his motor is broken. They get another car, a bicycle repairman. Eventually, that guy takes them to the police station where they are arrested. And that's how Ceausescu's regime ends. But that's not the end of them. The end of them comes when his defense minister, a guy named Stănculescu, General Stănculescu, who, by the way, was a CIA asset since 1986, flies in, creates a kangaroo court, which is over in about 45 to 50 minutes, which you can watch on YouTube, by the way, with the translation. And then they are summarily shot by a three-man firing squad, which is also on YouTube. So that's how the regime ends. And the people who take over are former communists. A guy named Iliescu. He used to be the propaganda chief for Ceausescu. So things change in name only. Iliescu used to go to school with Gorbachev. He was Gorbachev's man. So that's why people today think that the Russians were involved in the coup. I have a different theory, which I put in the book. Now, if you go to Romania today, you will hear 100 different theories about what happened in that revolution. Nobody knows because the archives of the Securitate are still secret, and because most of these people are either still in power or their children are in power. And so they want to keep this secret as to who was involved in with what country. The snipers, by the way, from Timișoara, they caught a couple of them. They were not Romanian. They were Iraqis, Lebanese, all from the Middle East. They couldn't speak a word of Romanian. Question is, who put them up there? And why? Why did somebody want to start a bloody revolution? All the other countries had a peaceful revolution. If Gorbachev wanted to start a revolution, he could have done one, not a revolution, a coup, he could have done one easily. Okay, he didn't need a bloody revolution. In whose interest was it to be bloody? Okay, so this is what I investigate in the first book. The second book, The Bucharest Legacy, takes place 3 years later. It starts with Heflin tasked to bring a defector, a KGB defector from Bucharest to Langley. Now you have to remember, right at that point, Romania is an ally. Iliescu wants to join the European Union and NATO, which they eventually do. And so military airplanes would be able to go in and out of Bucharest all the time. So his task is simply to put a defector on the plane. So let me read you a little bit of the first chapter. It was a night like any other night he had known in Bucharest, only more so. 3 years after the revolution that was supposed to have brought relief to the millions of poor wretches, the city still resembled a celestial black hole rather than a European capital. Other than the central area of the city, the streets still stood in darkness, due partly to the lack of fuel and partly to the broken bulbs and smashed lampposts that still awaited replacement or repair. Not much has changed in the past 3 years. Cousin Irina, the diva actress, had been right. It would take a generation. So much for revolutions. But this night, the darkness acted as a friend to Bill Heflin. Even though Romania now classified itself as a democracy, and the streets no longer crawled with Securitate, former dictator Ceausescu's secret police, Bucharest had become a cauldron of foreign security forces, racketeers, thieves, and roaming gangs that vied for territory. He had been warned. Still, the days of Cold War espionage were over. Romania was now a US ally, and Russia was beginning to shed its own communist history with the election of Boris Yeltsin. The defector he was to meet was supposedly KGB, but this was no classic exfiltration. All Heflin had to do was drive him to the American embassy, babysit him for a few hours, then place him on one of the American military airplanes, which the friendly Romanian government now allowed to land and depart on a regular basis. The agency had asked him for this favor since he had already planned on returning to Bucharest, his first time back since the revolution, to check on his charitable organizations. They were run by his own teams of American personnel. He didn't trust the government to manage the money without their skimming off the top. Needless to say, this is not going to be an easy exfiltration. Why? Because the first chapter of a spy thriller especially has to have action in it. So you don't start the book with talking about the history of Romania. You start the book with an action sequence. So he eventually takes the defector out, brings him to Langley after a creative way of doing that. And at Langley, the defector has some interesting news. The news is that there is a mole inside the CIA. Not only that, but they know who the mole's handler is, a KGB agent who the CIA only knows by the code name of Boris. So now everybody looks at Heflin. He was the only one that ever met Boris. All these years, Boris was their golden boy, the boy who gave him the best intelligence from the KGB, even from inside the Politburo meetings. Was all of that planted by the KGB? Was Boris a triple agent? KGB, who was pretending to work for the CIA, was actually working for the KGB all along. Not only that, but if he is controlling a mole inside the CIA, who is the most obvious suspect, and that's Heflin himself. So that's how the second book starts. Now, Heflin has friends in the CIA, especially the director of operations, Elliot Ingram. And Ingram gives him a chance to prove himself, tells him to go and find Boris, bring him in, prove that he is innocent, and that way clear his name. Otherwise, the wolves in the CIA will have his head. So Heflin goes back to Bucharest to find Boris, where he finds that not only is he looking for Boris, but so is the KGB, and so is another class of people, the newly formed wealthy, the oligarchs. What nobody knows, other than Heflin, is that Boris has been dead for the past year and a half. So that is how the book starts, okay? How does he prove himself when Boris is dead? He has to find who the mole is, and he has to find how the KGB or the oligarchs are involved. And needless to say, since I have all of these strings of the plot, they all intertwine. So let's talk about oligarchs, because this is a book about the rise of the oligarchs. First of all, what is an oligarch? So the definition goes back to Aristotle. An oligarch is not a wealthy person, any wealthy person, is not a Bill Gates. An oligarch is a wealthy person whose wealth depends on the king or the ruler. The king gave him the wealth, and the king can take it away. we've had oligarchs throughout history in Western Europe, but they haven't been called that. They've been called dukes and earls and barons, but they were oligarchs. How did they get their wealth? They were given their wealth by the king for being great political allies, for being great generals or valiant heroes, and they were given a piece of land. They were responsible for the serfs on the land. They were responsible for getting taxes, for raising an army. Why did the king do this? Well, because he needed a network of strong people whose well-being, whose lives were intertwined with his, who had skin in the game. As long as he remained in power, they would be fine. So they were used to prop the king up so he can prevent anybody from toppling him. So these oligarchs also knew that if their loyalty ever wavered, the king could take their wealth away. Now, this is happening right now in Russia. It is reported that Putin had a meeting with his oligarchs at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, in which he told them, you better be with me because I made you and I can bring you down. So they're all with him because they have no choice and because their own wealth is involved in his remaining in power. So oligarchs have existed throughout history, and they also existed during the communist era. Let me just tell you what communism was like. The corruption was endemic. It started anywhere from the butcher. If you could either stand in line for 4 hours to get a slab of beef and realize that halfway through it, the door closed because they're out of meat, or you could bribe the butcher to hold a piece of meat for you and then deliver it in the afternoon. You wanted to go to the doctor, you had to bribe him with money or a chicken or a dozen eggs. It didn't take much, but you couldn't go empty-handed. If you needed surgery, you'd better have your grandmother's jewelry available. If you wanted to buy a car, you first had to get the money and save it. There was no loan. And then you present it to the manager, who then put you on a list. If you didn't give him any money, he would put you at the end, which was a 5-year wait for a car. Depending on how much you gave him, he would raise you up on the list. The apparatchiks underneath in the bureaucratic system stole endemically from government coffers. And they demanded bribes. If there was a Western company who wanted to do business with Romania, for instance, buy grain, because that's basically all Romania could sell was either grain or natural metals, they would have to go through several layers of the bureaucracy up until they reached Ceausescu himself. And at each layer, they had to bribe the official that they were dealing with. Ceausescu was the biggest thief of all. He had reportedly amassed over $1 billion in offshore accounts, which were never found, by the way, which gives the writer another opportunity to use it in his book. By the way, just to show you how greedy Ceausescu was, it is confirmed that during his years in the 80s, he sold the American military not just the plans, but actual systems, military systems that the Russians, the Soviet Union, the Russians were providing them. The actual rockets, and in fact, they even sold a radar system that helped the military design their stealth bomber. And he wasn't even the only one. There were the Czechoslovakia then, now it's the Czech Republic, but Czechoslovakia did the same thing. Poland and Hungary were all selling military equipment In fact, there was a tank, a Russian tank, that the US military received to study its strengths and weaknesses and so forth. It saved the American government billions of dollars in development. So everybody was corrupt, up and down the bureaucracy. Did Ceausescu know this? Of course he knew it, because his Securitate, his Secret Service, had dossiers on all of these people. To get you and give you an idea how many dossiers they had, the Stasi, the East German secret police, when the two Germanys were joined, they opened up their files. They had 111 kilometers of floor-to-ceiling files, millions of files on their citizens. So the Securitate was as good or better than the Stasi. So they haven't released all of them. They've only released a few. So they are still hoarding their own files. So the Securitate had dossiers on all of these apparatchiks who were stealing from the government. If Ceausescu ever wanted to get rid of any one of them, he could simply bring out this evidence and say, you're a crook, you're going to jail, and whatever. But he didn't do that. Why? Because he was creating his own oligarch system. As long as he was in power, these people were stealing from the government and getting wealthy. And you have that system, excuse me, in all of the communist states, including Russia today. People are analyzing today why the Russian military is so weak. There are two reasons. One is that the military, as they did during the Russian days, is stealing from the budgets, so leaving huge gaping holes in the military and building yachts instead, or villas in Monaco. And secondly, every tyrant puts his trust only in people who are loyal, not in people who are competent. So loyalty is important over competence. So these generals who are making all these mistakes are loyal to Putin, but they're certainly not the best generals that he could have. So this military that NATO was afraid of can't even defeat Ukraine, and everybody in NATO is now laughing, okay? So all of these people had dossiers that Ceausescu was aware of, in which their crimes were documented. What happened when Ceausescu fell? And there was this transition to democracy. First of all, who was in charge? Communists, former communists. Iliescu was a former communist, and so was everybody else in the whole structure. They just put on different hats and said, now we are Democrats. And the Securitate, what happened to them? Well, they found themselves with all of these dossiers on all of these, crimes of all these people who are in power still. What did they do with these dossiers? They used them for blackmail. So it is not an accident that all of these oligarchs in Romania turned out to be former Securitate people. How did this happen? It wasn't what people think, that oligarchs were smart and they took advantage of stupid bureaucrats or government officials and stole companies. During this transition process, companies had to be privatized from the communist system to the private capitalist system, and they were supposed to be done orderly and so forth, given papers signifying stocks to all of its employees. That never happened. Instead, all of these companies went into the hands of a few leaders of the Securitate. And the Securitate and the government became partners, okay? This whole transition process was a guided transition from the wealth of the government into the hands of a few who became the oligarchs. And the people in government either received huge bribes or became secret partners of these new entities. It became so flagrant that the government actually gave loans to these new oligarchs in order to buy these companies that they were being sold for pennies, okay? And I mean, it just becomes unbelievable. So you have this new class of oligarchs that Heflin is encountering in Bucharest. Who are these oligarchs in other countries? They're the same thing. You go to Bulgaria, the secret police of Bulgaria created all of these oligarchs there. In Russia, it was a little different. Yeltsin hated the KGB because the KGB tried to overthrow Gorbachev with a coup. It failed because Yeltsin stood on that tank, if you remember, and rallied the people, and the coup failed. As a result, Yeltsin broke up the KGB, threw away, did away with the leadership. But the KGB always remembered, and they wanted to get back into power. Their man became Putin, which I talk about in the third book, which you're not going to see yet. But the KGB had a plan all along to return to power. The oligarchs that Yeltsin created, and he created his own oligarchs, because the oligarch system works. We have it here, but I'll talk about it in a minute. The oligarchs that Yeltsin created were his friends. They were not former KGB. They were political allies. When Putin came to power, he threw those people out and put his own KGB pals in there. So the oligarch system has a long history. It occurred in practically every former communist state. And in fact, it is such a good system that non-communist states are using it. If you look at Turkey today, Erdogan has created his own oligarch system of 20 years that he's remained in power. He's given contracts, government contracts, to friends and allies, who in turn buy up media companies. They use this propaganda to keep him in power. And every so often, they are found out that they have stolen money, especially, for instance, recently with the volcanic tremors. They found out that all these houses that they built, these friends of Erdogan, fell during the tremors because they were poorly built, because all of these people stole money from that they got, right? Now, if you're laughing, remember the FDR. The FDR, for many years during the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, constantly was in disrepair. And I remember reading articles which said basically that it was poorly built by the contractors who originally created it. They stole money and they built it poorly. So it happens everywhere. In Hungary, you have Viktor Orban, who has created his own oligarch system. He comes out and says it. We have an illiberal democracy here. And yes, the oligarch system is created here because it is a good way of stabilizing capitalism and the free market system. This is how he puts it. So I use that theme in the second book. How were the oligarchs created and who backed them up? So we come full circle to the United States. Now, by definition, like I said, the strict definition, we don't have oligarchs here. All of these wealthy people made their money on their own. They started out in, some of them in their own garage or whatever. But who are we kidding, right? They use the campaign finance system, which many politicians have called a legal form of bribery, to control what laws are being passed, and anything from tax laws to gun laws to whatever they need. So the oligarchs are living in the United States as another version. Their wealth doesn't depend on which leader is in power, and they were not made by the leader or given to them by the leader, but they control much of the government and of the laws. So Bill Heflin has to combat not only the oligarchs, but the KGB, and also in the second book, he tries to find out his own past. You can't write a book where the hero doesn't have a personal stake in what is happening. Now, let's talk a little bit about spy novels. You have a whole range of different types. On the one end, you have Jean le Carré, where there's very little action. It's mostly all thinking and putting together puzzles and figuring out one thing or another, where the mole is or whatever. On the other end, you have military-style espionage novels where there's very little thinking. There's, stopping the nuclear bomb before it blows up, or like Mission Impossible types, you find the virus and whatever. So between those two extremes, you have different authors writing in different ways, depending on their own interests and strengths. I'm not a big fan of big action, but I have action in the books. I am more towards the Jean le Carré type. So if you read some of the reviews on Amazon, you will see that. I think I'm reaching the end. If you have any questions from the audience, yes.
Yeah. So this, the secret cafe, they were like the Stasi of Romania.
Right.
And did they work directly for Ceausescu, pretty much, or kind of like the Stasi did, or were they sort of independent, or supposedly independent?
When Ceausescu was alive, yes. Did the Securitate, the Romanian version of the Stasi, work for Ceausescu, or were they an independent entity? They worked for Ceausescu. They worked for the communist system, okay? And their job during the communist days was, of course, to destroy any resistance. So you couldn't even say a joke about Ceausescu or the communist system. If you, just to give you an example, all the telephones were bugged. They came from the factory with a microphone inside. And that microphone could listen not only to your conversations on the phone, but to everything that went on in the room. So if you went to somebody's house, you would see the telephone cord going from the wall into either a drawer or a closet. Or you would see it wrapped up in a huge blanket. Everybody knew that they were being listened to. One of the oldest jokes, and that was still being told in the 80s, but that could get you arrested, was this one. Why do communists travel? Well, just to give you a background, Stalin killed all the intellectuals because he hated them and he was afraid of them. So the joke is, why do communists travel in threes? One guy to read, one guy to write, and the other guy to keep an eye on those two intellectuals. So that could get you arrested. And of course, Ceausescu was a peasant. He didn't have higher education. Neither did his wife, although she became the head of the chemistry department and published all sorts of papers that other people wrote for her. And people joked about his accent, which was a peasant's accent, but you could never do that in public. I was stupid at the beginning, and I was a big mouth, and I was an American. The first time I went back, I started talking in public, about the communist system and how do you like it, and stupid things like that. And I got one of these over the head by my cousin, and she pulled me aside and told me to shut up. So I quickly learned what you can say and what you cannot say. People who were visited by Westerners in Romania were routinely brought in after the Westerner left and interrogated for hours, if not days, to find out what they talked about. I mean, people open dossiers on themselves and see pictures and recordings of people that they met. Like I said, Ceausescu, when he fell, they found in the psychiatric wards over 100,000 people that were there for political reasons. So it was difficult to mount any kind of resistance during that period. People say, well, why did Romanians wait so long to have a revolution? Because it wasn't a real revolution. It was a coup. And nobody knows for sure who instigated it. But if you really want to find out, you got to read my book.
But, so if this Boris is always asking Heflin to meet in Romania, why doesn't he assume that Boris is part of the secret Dante and not? Why does he assume that Boris is a KGB if he's always asking to meet in Romania?
Well, in the second book, I have a lot of explanations about who Boris is and why he's attracted to Romania so much. So I'm sorry I can't give that away. But there is a reason for it.
You said there was a lot of money transported out of Romania and hidden. Who is claiming it now? How are they going about getting it back?
Well, that's the funny thing. They didn't find it. Okay, I'm sorry. What happened to the money that was taken out of Romania, both Ceausescu's money and other money? Well, all this money was put into numbered accounts. Now, let's just talk about Ceausescu's money, which was the most. Like I said, they thought it was over $1 billion. They never found it, okay? Which is another thing that I used in my book. Whenever there's a hole in history, the writer steps into it and creates his own reality, okay? So they never found the money. The reason they never found the money is because somebody got to it first, okay? There was a committee, the Romanian committee, that was established after the revolution. Took them months to be established, of course. And there was a Swiss committee, and by the time they actually looked, money was gone, okay? They knew what bank, but they didn't find the money. The money was emptied. It's very easy to wire money away. So, and now other people, depends on who they were. Some of them had offshore accounts. Some of them were found and arrested. Some of them disappeared again, mostly to their children who live very nicely in England or somewhere. And so a lot of these children are wealthy. And then, of course, a lot of these apparatchiks who had stolen money became the oligarchs. So over-involved with the oligarchs and got huge percentages in the new companies or kickbacks or one thing or another. Even today, there was a New York Times article a couple of days ago. They are whitewashing the revolution, in fact. Nobody in the Securitate, except the head, was ever arrested, okay? They were all protected by whoever is in charge at the moment. And there were journalists who interviewed, they were interviewed by Americans, but I put in the book that they are talked to by Heflin, who said, and this is real, in 1992, if Iliescu gets reelected, the oligarchs are safe, because after that they will have completed their task, and then it wouldn't matter who is in power. What is their task? Their task is buying up all the big companies and mines and everything else, okay? And after that, it doesn't matter who's in power. Every year, you have one or two officials that are being arrested and convicted by brave prosecutors. Either the judge dismisses the case, or the president, whoever the president is, doesn't matter, gives them, what is the word, lets them loose after a year or two. And so even if they got a 20-year sentence. So they are all being controlled by the oligarchs and the secret police, which is the oligarchs. And so the Secret Service now has more power than it ever had under Ceausescu, and it is less controlled by the parliament. In fact, it is a government within a government right now. And that is true among a lot of the former communist states. It is not an accident that most of these communist states were at the bottom of the list of Europe's most corrupt states, even if they are part of NATO and the European Union. And in fact, what they do in Romania and Hungary, of course, they use European loans to funnel them into their oligarchs, okay, through these contracts, no-bid contracts and everything else. So a lot of European money, which was intended to help bring these countries to their feet, is going into the pockets of the oligarchs. The other thing that went on in Russia, when Yeltsin started opening up the system, declared communism dead, billions of dollars left Russia. Where did that come from? It came from the KGB coffers, and it came from the Communist Party of the USSR. The Communist Party was dissolved. The billions in their coffers, nobody knows what happened to them. Now they do. What these officials of the Communist Party, or the former Communist Party, did is they emptied these coffers and brought them to numbered offshore accounts. Something that I go into the third book that I'm writing now, which is, what is that money used for? What was it meant to do? Well, it first made some of them very wealthy, but it was too much just for wealth. They were using this money for a planned return of the KGB, okay? And that was called Operation Luch, which you'll find out about in the third book. Operation Luch brought back the KGB and brought back Putin. Yes?
Very clear that you did a lot. You integrated fiction and truth together. How much research did you do? And how long did it take you?
That's a good question, because you can't say how much, because you don't know. You don't first do research. I'm sorry, how much research did I do? A lot of research, but it's not that you do research first and then you start writing. The research comes in as you need it. You know, like the CIA, I use it as a need-to-know basis. So if I want to write about what guns the CIA used during that period, I can find that out on the internet. If I want to know what guns the Russians used, the Makarov, I can find that on the internet. If I want to know what was the weather like on December 3rd, 1989 in Bucharest, I can find that on the internet. So I don't have to guess anymore. You know, Kafka wrote the book America without ever having visited America, okay? I don't have to visit Russia to tell you what the weather was like on a certain date. I can find that out. And then there is the research. Probably it's about a year, but it's not a year in a straight line. It's a year as I'm writing. The good thing about research, which I love, is it gives you ideas of how to go, where to go with the book. Suddenly you have characters. I found out about Stănculescu, General Stănculescu, that he was a CIA asset as I'm reading about the revolution. There was another guy named General Militaru. I mean, imagine having the name military as your last name and you're a general. It was like a Dr. Cell who writes about cells, but General Militaru was a KGB asset since 1985, okay? And he was involved in the planned coup to topple Ceausescu, which never happened because the time was never right, he says. And Iliescu, the guy who took over after Ceausescu, was involved in these plans for years. So you find these things out as you're doing the research, and you go, oh my God, here's a character I can use, okay? And so the other thing you have to know when you're writing 3 plots at the same time is you form a graph. And, well, first of all, you got to do the 3-act play, which is how most novels are written. That goes back to Aristotle, too. The first act, you introduce the character, and you introduce the inciting incident, which is what drives the character out of his comfort zone and challenges them to do something, okay? If the character agrees to go on this journey, there's a goal. So every character has to have a goal. That is the end of Act 1. Act 2 is the journey. It starts with obstacles. Every protagonist has to have an antagonist. Usually it's a person, but it doesn't have to be. It can be the weather, it can be whatever, a system. So the antagonist keeps putting obstacles in the way of protagonist reaching his goal. Each obstacle has to grow in severity. So there's a hump, a small hump. As the protagonist overcomes the obstacle, then the tension goes down. Then there's a lull. And the next one is a higher obstacle, the protagonist overcomes it, and there's another lull. You can't have tension, the same tension throughout the book with the same plot. So you have a graph of increasing hills. The last hill is where the climax occurs, and that's the end of Act 2. And then Act 3 is the resolution, where the character is shown that he has changed. Okay, you can't have the character remain the same. There's an arc, the so-called arc of the character, is how the character changes after having gone through all of these trials and tribulations. Now, there are books like James Bond books where the character never changes. James Bond is the same at the end of a movie as he is at the beginning of the movie, at least the first ones. At the end, the several latest, they want to make him more human. So there are some books where you have no arc. But in good books, you have to have an arc. Now, as I explained to you, those humps and valleys, that's for one plot. Then let's say that's the spy plot. Then you have the secondary plot, the love plot. Well, how do you arrange those peaks and valleys? You put the peaks in the secondary plot where there are the valleys of the primary plot. So you maintain the tension, but not of the same, using the same plot line. You get tension from the secondary plot line where the primary plot line is down. The same thing with the third plot line. You integrate those peaks where there are valleys in the first 2 plot lines. So that's how you integrate them. And of course, you have to integrate the characters. So the characters from one plot line has to integrate with, so there's a love story, but has to be involved in the revolution and has to be involved with Boris. So those are the 3 plot lines that get intertwined by the end. So there's a lot of work goes on into this. Okay.
More than just
All right.
We learned a lot more than we thought we would learn. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Bill. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Wonderful.
And thank you for coming here. And I hope your book gets made into a film. That would be fascinating.
I'm waiting.
I
Thank you all for coming in the
Okay.
rain.
Thank you.